Okay, so this video we're going to talk about the International Plumbing Code, Section 504.6, the requirement for discharge piping. Discharge piping, it says the discharge piping serving a pressure relief valve, temperature relief valve, or combination thereof shall. When we're talking about this, we're talking about on the side of the water heater, the gold discharge of the TNP line. So it's a temperature and relief valve combination, temperature and pressure. That valve opens up if it gets too hot, the pressure gets too high, prevents the water heater from exploding. It's a safety device, and it is required to be built into all water heaters. So there's 10 points we're going to discuss about the discharge piping. Of course, we know that discharge piping, it can't be PEX, it has to be CPVC or copper. But as we read through these, I said 10, there are 14 points. We read through these 14 points, we're going to see what we can learn about our discharge piping. So point 1 says, not be directly connected to the drainage system. So we cannot discharge that pipe and connect it directly to a drain. Why not? Because the water heater is part of the potable or drinkable water supply, and we have to protect it from the bacteria in the drain. We're going to talk more about that. Where a lot of the plumbing code is all about protecting the potable water supply from contamination so that people don't become sick. So point 2, it says it has to discharge through an air gap located in the same room as the water heater. Point 3, not be smaller than the diameter of the outlet of the valve served, and shall discharge full size to the air gap. So we're going to talk about the diameter a little later. Right now, I want to talk about this air gap. So we got 2 points here discussing the air gap. What is an air gap? We see air gaps all the time. Air gaps are an integral part of the plumbing system. They are what helps protect the drinking water from the drainage system. So in IPC, the International Plumbing Code, Chapter 2, the definitions, the air gap, it says, the definition is the unobstructed vertical distance through the free atmosphere between the lowest opening from any pipe or faucet supplying water to a tank, plumbing fixture, or other device and the flood level rim of that receptacle. Okay, so in this example, it's a standard vanity sink. All sinks have an air gap built into them. This is the receptacle. It is the basin, the sink itself. What is the flood level rim? Well, it's right here on the edge where my mouse is pointing. We see there's a drain at the bottom. There's an overflow, but if that backs up, what's the water going to do? It's going to come right out, and it's going to flood and pour out the side. That's the flood level rim. The faucet, where the discharges from the pipe, will always be above that flood level rim. Why? That's so that if the drain backs up, that water is going to be contaminated with nasty bacteria that could go up the pipes, get into the pipes, and get into the drinking water supply. So we have an air gap, an air distance between the pipe, the free atmosphere, and the flood level rim of where potentially contaminated water could be. That's air gaps. They're everywhere in the plumbing system, and they're designed to protect the drinking water from the bacteria and harmful bacteria that could be in the drainage system. So when we're talking about water heaters, we're looking at the air gap on a discharge piping. We see in our example, and we see that sometimes we get this wrong. We run that discharge pipe all the way down to the pan, but we have to have an air gap there. If you see in our illustration, the discharge piping for the TNP line here running down the side, it does not go into the pan. It terminates above the pan. So we're going to jump ahead to point 10, bullet point 10 of 504.6. We've discussed 1, 2, and 3, but we're talking about air gaps in 2 and 3, and we're going to jump ahead to point 10 because it's related. So point 10 says that it should terminate not more than 6 inches above and not less than 2 times the discharge pipe diameter by the floor or the flood level rim of the receptor. So we always discuss, it's a 3/4 pipe, 2 times that is 1.5 inches. So the minimum distance you can have at the bottom of your TNP pipe is 1.5 inches. The maximum is 6 inches. 4.5 inch window. We see that in an illustration right here. But that doesn't apply to the bottom of the pan. It applies to the flood level rim, the top. So this T&P valve, it cannot go down into this receptor and say, oh, I'm more than 1.5 inches in the bottom, I'm okay. No, you have to be 1.5 inches to 6 inches above the flood level rim. So that's the top of the pan. Again, that's that air gap. If that water is somehow contaminated, if there's germs, bacteria, because it's been sitting there for 10 or 15 years before this thing decides to erupt, and let's say there's roach dirt, mouse dirt, whatever germs in there, we don't want this piping to come in contact. If this thing discharges, the drain is obstructed and it begins to overflow. We want to have that unobstructed distance between the free atmosphere and the flood level rim. That's the air gap required to protect the potable water supply, the drinking water. So that's what that means when we have an air gap on our discharge piping. If the pan wasn't there, then that air gap has to be between the floor. Say we're on a garage on a slab, and we're not putting a pan in, even though I think we should do it all the time whenever possible. If we're not going to do that, there still has to be an air gap between the floor and the bottom. But if there's a pan, it's the flood level rim. Any kind of tank, any kind of receptor, it's that flood level rim where if that drain backs up, that piping is not in direct contact with the drain water. All right, continuing on IPC 504.6. So we jumped ahead to cover point 10, but we're gonna go back to point 4. Serve a single relief device and shall not connect to piping serving any other relief device or equipment. So that means that each water heater has to, with a T&P valve, has to have its own T&P piping. You can't tie it into another water heater if the home has two. You can't tie it into the discharge piping, for the HVAC. It has to serve only the single relief device. So each water heater has to have its own discharge piping. Number 5, discharge to the floor, to the pan serving the water heater or storage tank, to a waste receptor, or to the outdoors. So yes, sometimes you'll see these things are piped to the outdoors. You can do that. There still has to be an air gap at the end. You can't run it right down into the flower beds, into the dirt. The same thing, reason why we cannot have bacteria come into those pipes and get into the drinking water. There has to be an air gap. And as we read further, we'll see more reasons why we can discharge to the outdoors. Point number 6, discharge in a manner that does not cause personal injury or structural damage. All right, so it can't be, the reason why it has that 1.5 inches to 6 inches, that twice the pipe, we want to discharge it into the floor where it's not likely to cause personal injury. If that thing is up on a shelf and you've got an air gap and it goes off and somebody's near that shelf and they're below it, the hot water that comes out of there could scald them. Right, so that would not be an appropriate way to have that pipe down. We would have to pipe that to a manner that could not cause personal injury. We might want to take that on down to the floor or even outside. Point number 7, discharge to a termination point that is readily observable by the building occupants. What does this mean? You'll see these ones that pipe outside. When you're replacing units, sometimes you might find them piped to the crawl space. That is a no-no. Crawl space is not readily observable. You have to be able to observe it without opening a door and climbing in or putting a flashlight on. It has to be readily observable by the building occupants. If that thing is leaking, they should be able to notice it. So that air gap to the outdoors, someone walks past it, they see water coming out of there, they know there's a problem. Oftentimes in mobile homes, you'll see that they're just piped right through the floor, right into the crawl space. Mobile homes get away with a lot of things. A lot of them say, well, there's no foundation because there's no skirting, so they get away with it. But if there is a foundation, it does not meet that code. It's got to be piped to the outside. Point number 8, very simple. It cannot be trapped. All right, so let's look at our next point. Number 9, has to be installed so as to flow by gravity. Can't go uphill. It's got to flow by gravity. It's got to be running downhill all the time. Point number 11, we're skipping there because we already covered point 10, that twice the pipe diameter to 6 inches distance. Point number 11 says not have a threaded connection at the end of such piping. Pretty simple. Point number 12, you cannot have valves or T-fittings, so there can't be a shutoff valve in that discharge piping, or a T-fitting connecting it to something else. Point number 13, it has to be constructed of those materials listed in section 605.4 or materials tested, rated, and approved for such use in accordance with ASME A112.4.1. So you hear us all the time saying we can't use PEX for our TMP line. Why do we say that? But then you go into a big box store and they've got these little ones you can buy and they're made out of PEX. Well, those have been engineered, they've been tested, they've been rated, and they are approved. The standard PEX you're going to find in your truck and the little fittings, that has not been approved for such use, and there's another reason, and that's at point number 14. Point number 14 says it must be one nominal size larger than the size of the relief valve outlet. Where the relief valve piping is installed with insert fittings, the outlet end of such tubing shall be fastened in place. So when dealing with standard water heaters, that outlet, that TMP valve outlet is 3/4 of an inch. So what they're saying is the pipe can never reduce in size. It cannot be less than 3/4 of an inch. So when we're talking about insert fittings, go to our next slide. Installed with insert fittings. You see here in the illustration, we have a PEX male adapter made of brass. Notice that it reduces down in size so that it can insert into the PEX pipe. So this insertable portion of the PEX pipe fitting reduces the size of the opening, restricting the flow. Remember from point 3, you cannot reduce its size. Point 14 said you can only do this if you go one nominal pipe size larger. You would have to go immediately to 1 inch before you could use PEX. But because of point 3, we don't use PEX or any insertable type fittings that would reduce the size of that opening, restricting the water heater, the TMP valve's ability to relieve pressure quickly on the water heater. Now, so the final point on 14 said the outlet end of the TMP piping, discharge piping, shall be fastened in place. We see this where it's piped into a water heater or to the floor. Notice in our illustration we see the TMP pipe. This is CPVC. It's strapped close to the end. That is the code. If that thing pipes outside, same thing. You have to strap it close to the end of the pipe. The outlet end has to be fastened in place. That is code. And our illustration looks like our TMP valve line got below the flood level rim of that pipe though. But it's easy thing to forget. We're talking about our discharge piping, our TMP discharge piping. A lot of little codes. Can save this video and review it. But a lot of little things. We want to pay attention to these little things because if you pay attention to the little things, everything else will fall in place. But we're discussing, again, discharge piping, and that'll conclude this discussion, and we'll continue with more water heater codes in the future.